All right, it is 12 o'clock. I'd just like to say thank you for joining us for this Lunch and Learn. My name is Jared Hagenow, a communications specialist with the Indiana Board of Animal Health. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Teams chat. We will answer them at the end. BOA also has a page talking about HPAI and current detections in Indiana. If you are a veterinarian or registered veterinary technician, you can qualify for 1 hour of continuing education credit through pre-registration and by watching the seminar. Let me introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Karcher. Dr. Karcher has been charged with developing a strong poultry extension program. His interactions with the industry revolve around organizing educational programs in the Midwest with the Multi-State Poultry Health Management School, Multi-State Poultry Nutrition Conference, and Midwest Poultry Federation education programs. He serves on the board of directors for the National Egg Quality School, Poultry Health Management School, and Midwest Poultry Federation. Dr. Karcher has developed an extension program that improves poultry production regardless of scale and is grounded in science. He has focused on engaging directly the small flock audience, many of whom have little to no connection to extension. In an effort to help them become successful and to have a positive poultry interaction, Darren's interactions with youth revolve around enhancing their knowledge of poultry, developing life skills, and igniting an interest in commercial poultry job opportunities in the future. He continues to seek grant dollars to establish a competitive applied research program to address producers' concerns focusing on turkey skeletal issues, laying hen management. His research programs are focused on addressing industry concerns in meat birds and laying hens. His program's focus is poultry well-being coupled with food safety and quality as impacted by management practices, psychology, and nutrition. So I'd like to thank you, Dr. Karcher, for speaking with us.
Thank you very much, Jared. And feel free to call me Darren. Next time, we'll give you an abbreviated bio to be more concise. But thank you for the introduction. So today I have been charged with talking about hobby poultry flock owners. What do they need to know about high-path avian influenza? As we know, this is on the top of mind for, I would argue, virtually everybody across the United States now, as we continue to see news stories come into our feeds about what is going on, both within the state of Indiana as well as nationally. So to give some perspective, if we look at the APHIS website, and so for the next few slides here, I'm pulling the information based on current reporting as of the 17th of February. This iteration of high-path that we are currently seeing here in the US actually began in 2022 in southern Indiana. We have not had a lull in the disease long enough for us to declare that it is over. So we are still considering this initial infection from 22 as part of the ongoing battle that we are facing currently. At this point in time, we are estimating 162.59 million birds have been impacted. If we look at just the last 30 days, looking across to both commercial and small flock, you can see based on the color of intensity, Ohio has been hit really hard, Missouri, and then Indiana and Pennsylvania, also California. So we're seeing this continued infection occurring across the United States, with some states being hit a little bit more severe than others currently. If we focus, though, let's break it down and look at just the commercial flocks in the last 30 days, we can see Ohio still is very prevalent in being impacted with detections as of the 17th of February. Now, if we switch it, though, and look at the backyard flocks or hobby small flocks, however you would like to define it, in the last 30 days, you can see Pennsylvania, New York, along the East Coast there, they have been dramatically impacted in the last 30 days. When we look at the total birds that have been impacted over the course of this incident, so clear back to 2022, were about 40,000 birds that have been impacted, with 2,200 birds being impacted since January 1 of this year. So, what makes this so very different, and why should we be concerned about it? Well, a great example to give you an idea of how this may manifest, and it's best to see it and have those take home images if we're looking at a commercial flock. These are pictures from a flock where, and I just threw in some random timestamps and days of the week, okay? But let's say it's Monday morning. We know it's always a challenge on Monday. Walk in, these turkeys look great. They look like we would expect. When this producer was impacted, 2 hours later, he went back in, and you can see already there is a very different behavior. There's also a very different look to this flock of turkeys from the last one. Those turkeys now are starting to, they look sick, they look unhealthy. Here in the forefront of the picture, where the arrow is, you can see a bird that has already passed away. And so in that 2 hour time frame, we saw a complete change in that entire flock. And roughly 2 hours later, then went back in again to take a picture, and you can see now we are having a major mortality event. So this iteration of high path, and this is fairly typical, you go in, you will see some mortality, and it's going to impact flocks very quickly. In some instances, and we'll talk further about this, how you can keep this in mind when we're talking about small flock. What I talked to a group yesterday about is we want to look for patterns, and we'll talk more about patterns of mortality and how we can use that as a way to help us stay in touch with what may be going on. So let's talk about some of the basics when we are talking about high path, and also to put it into the context of the state here for Indiana. So when we look at our poultry production by the numbers, you can see in our top six, we've got what? 4 of the top 6 in our national rankings are going to be related to poultry. So we are, in fact, a very heavy poultry production state. We also, in certain areas, are extremely dense when it comes to poultry production. Now, while this may be the commercial, you can see even in the poultry sector, we have had major growth in all 4 of our production species. What this does not capture, and it is very complicated to capture, is the small flock and hobby production that has also been increasing. Now, to what you may not know is, in my background, my parents own a mail order hatchery out of Ohio. I can tell you that this same growth that we are seeing in the commercial production in the last 3 to 5 years, they have also seen just as much growth in the small hobby production as well, with people that are more interested in being able to produce their own meat, produce their own eggs as the egg prices continue to rise, and just wanting to move away from commercial agriculture as the source of poultry protein. Now, if we look at the registered poultry premises, this is currently what is registered in the state of Indiana, and you can see it's being portrayed as a heat map. And so within the BOA system, this captures both the commercial and small flock people that have registered. And so you can see that we have certain areas that are extremely dense. So up here in that Elkhart area, over here along the J. Adams, and then down here in Du Bois, Davies County, those tend to be our more dense poultry production counties within the state. Now, to help you better visualize what this may mean, and this is part of the conversation that we have to have, while this may be a commercial facility, and you can see that each one of these barns here is going to be a house of commercial egg layers, and that's what this picture is. When we have a facility like this that may be impacted with high path avian influenza, the approach has been from a federal response that we go in and we will eliminate all birds on the premise. And so while we may have a detection at this facility, we may be in fact impacting 3 to 4 million birds, depending on the scope of that particular commercial facility. On the other side, though, if we look at small flock production, this may be an example of what you could come across within the communities where we may have mixed flocks. We are going to be much smaller in scale. So maybe it's, as few as 6 to 8 birds. It could be up to a couple hundred birds in that particular flock. So the relative impact of a high path infection within this small flock compared to the commercial flock, it's going to be immensely different. That does not, change the way that we are going to respond to that virus infecting those birds. But when we start to look at the numbers and the sheer scope of the amount of birds that have been impacted, we know that every time it touches a commercial facility, it's going to have a bigger number of birds that are going to have to be depopulated. So now going back, because the last time that we've really had a run of high path in the United States was back in 2015. And these were the confirmed cases at that point in time. We had about 48 million birds that were impacted in that run of high path here in the United States. But when you start to look at our economic impact, right, we had a direct impact across our entire economies, not just in the birds themselves for the loss of life, but also within the amount of jobs that were lost, our value of our products that we produced. And you can see there at that point in time, we had 6 to 9 months of elevated egg prices as a result. What we have to keep in mind is when we start seeing this impact on egg laying birds, it will take us a much longer period of time to get that production back up to the level that we are used to, because we are talking 18 weeks just to get those birds ready to produce the eggs, another 4 to 5 weeks to actually get them into that egg production. And so when we lose those birds, it will trickle longer for our elevated egg prices that we are, seeing in the grocery stores today. In 2016, we had some impact here for high path as well in Indiana, and you can see that we had about 414,000 birds that were affected. Some commercial layers, but most of them were turkeys. And you can see that down here in this green circled area, that's where we're talking about the impact that we felt within the state in that iteration in 2016. So why does this keep happening? And how does this keep happening, right? It would be very useful if we could better understand that virus, better understand why this is happening, and keep it within the context of what we're dealing with today. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have been keeping eyes on what is happening within our state here in Indiana, but I pulled this information from the BOA website this morning, and you can see that these are our current premises that have been impacted. Now, there was an announcement yesterday of a new one up in Elkhart County that is not on the dashboard at this point in time. But as you can see here, for the birds affected, initially here when we started in January, okay, yes, it's unfortunate, but as we have continued later into February, later in January, moving into February, now we're starting to see some significant impact in the amount of birds as commercial egg producers are experiencing that infection. The other thing to be aware of when we look at it, everything has been depopulated. That's a great thing that has been done in a timely manner. But the other thing is when we look at these surveillance zones, you can see which ones are no longer under surveillance versus those that may be active at this point in time. The reason this becomes important is as we look at these surveillance zones, and we talk more about them here in a little bit, it may impact the way that we have to look at small flock production, the way we may have to think about things that are occurring within our counties when it comes to poultry education or to poultry showing. And so we'll touch on all of those items here in a little bit. Now, the major shift that has occurred since the 2014, 15, 16, those years of high-path avian influenza, it became very evident that there was a lot of spread of that virus at that point in time as a result of insufficient biosecurity within our commercial entities. That is no longer the case. What we are seeing with this iteration of high path that has been influencing us over the last 3 years is it is a point source introduction. And what this graphic helps you to understand is it is a reservoir in the wild bird population. And it is just by your luck that you had birds that flew over the facility, defecated, and now that virus is closer to your respective poultry species. In this case, right, you could say this is a commercial flock. Okay, fine, whatever. There is equal opportunity for this virus to impact small flock as it is for commercial. It does not matter that I am a small flock that has outdoor access. It does not matter if I am a small flock that has everything environmentally controlled. So it means I have a very tight house for limited introduction of wild birds and other things that could bring that virus into the facility. If there is an opportunity where a wild bird that was carrying the virus deposited fecal matter, died around it, and you remove the bird, there is now that introduction of the virus into the environment, which is going to elevate the potential that you could, in fact, infect the small flock as well as what we are seeing within our commercial entities. Now, for those that may not be familiar for what it means, if we have an incident, we're going to start here where, okay, the black dot is our infected farm, and we're going to draw concentric circles around that farm. So we will have the infected zone, the buffer zone, or the surveillance zone, all right? This buffer and infected zone is our control area. And then we have this larger area that we are going to be keeping an eye on all of those poultry that fall in each one of these concentric circles to A, make sure we have containment of that virus, and B, it may dictate how we can move birds in or out of certain areas. Now, when we talk about permitted movement, we know that that's going to be more important for our commercial flocks, for their ability to move things in and out of the zones. For small flock, while it may not be permitted movement at this point in time, it does mean that we still need to be well aware of where they may be within these zones and provide some guidance on movement or no movement. The circle on the right is to give you an idea. If we take this area and we had to plot all of the registered premises, you can see that if any one of those became the infected area, we would then draw these circles all the way around each one of those infected areas or farms. Now, to make it a little more easier for you to visualize that, if we look at what is happening right now on the border between Indiana and Ohio, these are what the concentric circles look like that BOA is populating every time there is an infected premise that occurs. And so the red circle is going to be that infected area. We will then have the blue circle, which is going to be your one of your control zones, and then you will have the green larger circle, which is going to be part of your surveillance zone. And so you can see as you have more and more premises within an area become positive, these circles become much more intense. And so just because you may not be within a control zone or a surveillance zone today, depending on how those circles may fall, might change how it looks tomorrow. So with this one specifically, at the time this slide was created, we had 8 flocks that were positive here in Indiana. And you can see that we were up around 42 flocks that were positive in Ohio. And those circles do not care about state lines. And so it takes a lot of coordination then as we start to talk about responses between Ohio and Indiana as we are trying to investigate and keep track of this virus as it is moving amongst the hobby flocks as well as the commercial flocks. So to better help you think about these circles as well, if you have an infected site at the bottom of the triangle, we're going to have complete quarantine, depopulation, and disposal. If you are a negative flock within that control area, then this is where for that permitted movement that commercial flocks are experiencing, there will be sampling, there'll be testing, reporting, and then they can issue those permits to allow movement of birds or eggs, depending on what it is that they're trying to move out of that control area. And then if you are outside of that control area, it's business as usual. So there's nothing that you have to be concerned about. For hobby flocks, while you may not be worrying about the sampling, there is testing that can be made available through BOA. And so if we have hobby flocks that end up in that control area, they can reach out to BOA and they can be part of the monitoring and the testing, but they will not have to be concerned about having permits issued for movement. Now, while this is very impactful to us as poultry producers and to the poultry industry, we have to keep in mind that the foremost important thing that we are concerned about and always keeping in the back of our mind is human health. At this point, CDC believes that there is no current risk to the general public, recognizing that those that may be directly interacting with poultry are going to be at the greatest risk. And so as we see these infections occur, we also know that the Department of Health, as well as the local health departments, are going to be working with BOA and with those entities that are impacted to monitor human health and make sure that we are on top of any potential spillover that may occur with this virus between poultry and human. This is something we need to keep in mind, that there is not a food safety threat. Everything that from a commercial entity that is leaving a permitted area is going to be tested ahead of time. That is how we help to ensure our food going into our food system is in fact okay for us to consume. Now, this slide I pulled directly from a shared set with BOA. And so in that presentation, they were also talking about milk, because we know that there has been some spillover into the dairy industry as well. Again, everything is in place to ensure that milk, eggs, poultry, all of those things going to the end consumer are being monitored, ensuring that we have good, healthy food entering our supply system. The biggest thing that we also need to be making aware to general public, for those of you that may be vets, to your clients, you do not want to be feeding raw poultry, raw products like that. And so BOA is encouraging and suggesting strongly that you advise your clients to consider other means of providing that nutrition to their pets. We have seen the documented cases where cats have become sick from consuming products that were contaminated with the HPAI virus. If you have further questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. We also have BOA representation on today that can help field questions that are beyond the scope of what I can talk about. So what is the best defense that we can advise to hobby flock owners at this point in time? And the answer is biosecurity. And biosecurity is going to look very different when we talk about a hobby flock compared to a commercial producer of poultry proteins. However, the principles will remain the same. So first and foremost, we want to make sure that owners are aware of their traffic. And what I mean by that is who or what might be visiting their flocks. And so every time I visit with small flock producers, I want them to be aware of who is coming onto your premise, why are they coming onto your premise, and if they are not necessary to be there, then I would encourage you to not have them visit your poultry flock. So when we think about the people that they may be interacting with, we would want to make sure that they're not visiting bird shows, swap meets, going over to see their neighbor because he said, hey, or she has said, I've got some sick birds. Can you come take a look? Because I know you have chickens. If they are going to visit these types of interaction with other poultry beyond their flocks, we are going to want to encourage them to shower, change clothes, shoes, whatever is necessary before they go in to see their own birds. We do not want to be the reason that all of a sudden we have brought a virus into their flock is because they were out visiting other poultry species. We want to encourage them that if you've got your school clothes, street clothes, whatever you would like to call it, that you have a dedicated set of clothes and shoes that you wear only into your poultry facility or poultry house, habitat, whatever you would like to call it, so that we can minimize the potential of bringing things into our birds. Additionally, the other thing that we can emphasize is to think about the fact that if we have a sickness, we do not want to be the person to take that sickness to other birds. Point 3, we really want to limit that interaction of people coming into our chicken coops. So if they are coming over, we need to try to provide them with something to help minimize what they may bring in on the bottom of their shoes or on their respective clothes. If that is not a possibility, I have suggested to youth in the past, you could easily get those shopping bags that you pick up at Walmart, Meijer, places like that. Put those over your shoes before you go into the chicken coop and then throw them away when you come out. It's at least something to try to have a biosecurity in place, even though it may not be the most ideal thing to be using. Finally, then, for the fourth point here, we want to encourage them, if they have dedicated shoes or boots, that they're trying to remove any litter or manure from those before they would leave the chicken coop. And ideally, if they could disinfect them, that would be amazing. I recognize, and we should all recognize, that the ability of them to really follow some of these biosecurity measures may not be in place, but we want to give them as much information and allow them to make the decisions that can fit their biosecurity the best for their small flock. We want to talk about isolation. And what I mean by that is in this picture, you can see that we've got some ducks mixing with the chickens, mixing with the turkeys. I know that this is not what we want to see. The reality is there's probably a lot of this that is going on. So what we need to do is if you have mixed flocks or you have clients with mixed flocks, we want to encourage them that at least try to keep that nucleus of birds together and limit the exposure of wild birds coming into your poultry house. What that may mean is that you might need to feed and water your birds in the house and not outside. If we can take away some of that easy food access as well as that water access, hopefully that can reduce the attractant of wild birds to come and mix with our poultry. So some of the things to think about when we're talking about the isolation, we want to make sure we're not letting dogs and cats in with our poultry. I understand that some may be using them as ways to either protect the birds if they're dogs or to be rodent disposers if they have cats. That is fine if that is the approach, but we need to keep a perimeter and keep them out of interacting with our chickens directly. We want to limit the rodents coming into the area where our birds are at. And again, we can only do as much as we can. So we want to suggest it. We want to encourage it. But the reality is we may just not have a facility at which we can keep the rodents out of it. We want to keep the wild birds from mingling with them, keep them out. If that means we need to use some netting to help block off open areas into our chicken coop, we need to go ahead and encourage using that as a way to keep those wild birds out. If we have mortality, we are going to want to pick it up on a daily basis and dispose of it properly. If for some reason we are bringing new birds into our flock, or we have taken our birds and taking them to a show or taking them off of our premise, we are going to want to quarantine those birds. What I mean by this is we want a location at which we can put these birds so they're not interacting with the rest of our birds. A minimum of 21 days is where we would want to keep these birds separated from the rest of our flock. As we're caring for our birds, we would do our own birds first and do our quarantine birds last. So if there is a disease or virus, something there that we do not want in our chicken coop, those birds are the last thing we see before we would be done taking care of our poultry for the day. That then should allow us to have clean clothes, clean shoes before we visit our birds the next day. If we are concerned after that 21-day period, you could easily take one or two of your birds from your flock, mix them in with those quarantine birds for 5 to 7 days. If you notice that those birds that you moved from your flock to the quarantine birds become sick, obviously we have a problem. And so then we need to look at what are our solutions for identifying whatever the disease or issue is that we see in our birds now, as well as who is the person that can help us identify the veterinary care to help resolve the issue that we now have. The other thing that we want to do from a biosecurity standpoint is encourage sanitation and cleaning of all the equipment and of the building itself where the chickens are located. My recommendation is that you would clean your building and your nesting area if you have laying hens at least twice a year. I would typically advise that you clean sometime in September as we're going into fall before the weather changes. This would allow you to have some accumulation of bedding and litter material in your chicken coop going into the winter, which will help provide insulation, allowing for the chicken coop to be more warm. Then the other time would be sometime around April to clean the house out. The reason being, when we get into our winter months, we end up with minimum ventilation. What I mean is we're keeping our chicken house fairly tight so that we can keep it warm. As a result, we tend to see a lot more moisture because every time that those chickens are breathing, they're releasing moisture into the air. We have our natural water coming into the environment. And so we can take any of that bedding that may be wet or not of the consistency that we want out of the chicken coop before we go into our spring and summer. If we have a dirt floor, ideally we would want to go in and turn over the top 6 inches. If we've had any health issues, that would essentially bury whatever those challenges are in the ground before we put our new birds back into our building. We want to give downtime between the cleaning of our building and putting our birds back in. So 2 weeks would be an ideal time if you can afford to have that leeway between cleaning your facility or your chicken coop and then having that ability to put the birds back in. And the most important thing to remind people is that sunshine and time are going to be our friends. So even with our equipment, if we decide or encourage a cleaning of the equipment once a month, every couple weeks, there's no reason that they can't clean the equipment, leave it outside for a few hours if it's a nice sunny day to help dry things off, help to eliminate any potential viruses that may be present on the equipment itself. And then we can always put it back into our chicken coop at that point. So when we talk about disinfecting our equipment, we want to make sure that we remove all of that organic material. Usually soap and hot water is the easiest way to do it. If we're going to be using it then with baby poultry, we're going to want to also disinfect it. And that could easily be accomplished by using a chlorine solution after you have cleaned it with soap and water, just to help eliminate anything that you may have missed. The important thing to remember is that if we are using chlorine, if we have any organic material, so that could be any dried egg on it, any clumps of feed, fecal material, anything like that, it will inactivate the chlorine and it will then essentially be useless for what you're trying to achieve. And then we want to encourage that we don't share our equipment with other poultry people. I know that within the poultry community, everyone is willing to help each other out. But when we are faced with disease challenges, things like high path, as much as we may want to help each other out, we have to take those extra precautions to ensure we don't have bigger issues down the road. So some considerations that you would want to have with your small flocks or with your clients that have small flocks. First and foremost, have they considered registering their premise ID with BOA? This is going to make life a lot easier if we have an outbreak in identifying those flocks that we need to be in touch with. We want to encourage cooperation with the state and federal officials. While it is hard for some people to believe, the state and federal officials, when they come knocking on your door, are actually there to help you. They are not there to make your life miserable or to take your birds away from you. They are truly trying to do what is best to make sure everybody has a positive poultry experience. Finally, observation is going to be key for any hobby producer. They are likely going to be very aware of subtle changes that may occur within the flock. These may be behavior changes. They may be the fact that when they walk into the chicken coop, they hear something that doesn't sound normal. It could be that they walk in and they are acutely aware of something that smells differently. If they are around their chickens long enough, they will start to pick up on these subtle changes. One of the ways that we can help them identify high path if there is a concern, or any disease if there is a concern, is to look for patterns of mortality. What I mean by this is if they walk in and they have a dead bird today, tomorrow they go back and they have 2 dead birds or 3 dead birds. The day after that, they have another mortality, maybe a single bird. We are starting to see a pattern of increased mortality. We would want to encourage reaching out to BOA if they're concerned it might be HPAI, or to reach out to the local extension agent or even to myself to talk through what is going on so that we can be aware of concerns like this as they might arise. That is everything I have for now. I wanted to make sure that we had sufficient time to address some of the questions that I know came in ahead of time, as well as anything that may have been populated during the presentation.
Okay, thank you for talking with us, Dr. Darren. If you wanted to go down the list of pre-registered questions, and then we'll try and tackle some of the questions in the chat here. We got a few.
Yep, that sounds great. So one of the questions that came in early was asking about parrots and giving them outdoor access in an aviary for a couple of hours. Wondering if it is still safe to release your parrots. This could apply to any sort of pet birds that they may have some outdoor space that you put them in. At this point in time, that would apply for pet birds as well as poultry. They are going to be susceptible. So every time you put them out there, you increase that potential risk and opportunity for the virus. I will not say to you, do not do it, but you just need to be aware that there is always that potential that every time they are outside that they could come in contact with that virus. Another question that came in was, is there anything specific on protecting our meat birds? Again, meat birds, egg layers, there's not going to be anything different that we would do from the standpoint of how we interact with biosecurity, with our neighbors, or with any other poultry or wild birds that we may come in contact with. So we want to make sure that we talk about poultry as a collective whole and how we may interact with them. The only benefit if you end up having an issue is that with meat birds, you would have a very short turnaround at being able to repopulate your flock with more meat birds, as opposed to the egg layers, as I discussed earlier, where you have a much longer lead time to get them back to that production level that you may be expecting. Okay, so what is the level of testing for high pathogen sick birds? What's the submission process? How does this work between the ADDL, which is the Animal Disease and Diagnostic Lab here at Purdue University? So the way that this functions is that anybody, it does not have to be a veterinarian, it can be any citizen, can submit a poultry species to the ADDL for necropsy. All that needs to occur is that the owner needs to reach out and contact the diagnostic lab prior to showing up with the birds so that they can collect some information and tell you how to proceed with bringing the birds to the diagnostic lab for submission. Now, typically, the fee may range anywhere from $10 to $230. This is going to depend on what you are asking them to do. If you're asking them to just tell me, why did this bird die, it may be cheaper. If you're asking them to do a comprehensive workup and give you every potential thing that they see going on with this bird, it will be more expensive. Again, when you are going through that process of submission, you can ask those questions and they can give you a better idea of the actual cost. If for some reason you are unable to pay for the testing, there may be other avenues at which they can help to offset that cost. Now, if a veterinarian makes the submission, is there a fee? It will be no different if you are a veterinarian submitting or if you are a citizen submitting when it comes to the poultry cases. So again, contacting the ADDL, getting them some information that they need so you're sure how to get those birds submitted correctly, and then going through what sort of testing is going to be appropriate is the proper way to handle getting this information. Will the events be disrupted to prevent spread? And this could be trade shows, fairs. I had a conversation with the National FFA Poultry Committee a week ago about concerns of what it may look like if we couldn't have that contest in October. At this point in time, what is important to know is that BOA is in the state is allowing poultry exhibits to proceed as normal, with the exception if you are in a county that falls within the control area. And so it is a county by county determination by BOA if those poultry activities are allowed to occur. If you have questions, you can look up the information on the BOA website where they give you an indication of the control areas that are out there for those questions. You can also reach out to County Extension and they can help get that information for you as well.
Darren, I just posted the link to that in the chat if they want to go directly to the page with the control areas.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Denise. Okay, the question is, HPAI seems to be becoming ubiquitous. So what they mean by that is it's everywhere, and it seems to be taking up residency within our wildlife populations. So is depopulation of infected poultry flocks necessary as an effective management practice? Won't the population reach a herd immunity status naturally if we don't do anything and just completely let it run its course? So the current protocol of going in and depopulating is the national response that USDA has set for how we respond to high-path avian influenza. It is important to understand that high-path avian influenza, when it is endemic in a country, can have trade implications. So at this point in time, we do not want to take the approach of letting it run its course for the bigger picture of what that could mean for trade for the United States when we talk about our poultry production going to other parts of the world. Additionally, it is important to note there is no vaccine that is currently approved for use within the poultry species. When that changes, if it changes, their BOA, USDA, everyone will make sure people are aware of that as a potential mitigation strategy against high-path avian influenza. But again, just so everyone hears clearly, there is no approved vaccine that we are allowed to administer to poultry to help combat high-path avian influenza as a strategy. That, Jared, would conclude everything that we had submitted ahead of time.
All right, thank you. What some of the questions you answered did cover some of the questions in the chat, and Denise has been kind enough to help answer some of the ones in the chat. So I'll just kind of go down the list because we have quite a few here. When you were talking about wild birds affecting commercial and non-commercial flocks, the question is, are egg layers disproportionately impacted?
So at this point, if I haven't dug in specifically to look at egg layers, compared to our other poultry species at a commercial level. I can tell you that just because of the scope of the operations, we probably would see that we have had more egg layers impacted from sheer number of birds, but I cannot say that the amount of premises are equal, less than, or more than for egg layers compared to our meat birds.
Okay. Next question. How long does HPAI survive outside of the body at different temperatures of the year? Example, 3 days in 30-degree weather versus 3 hours in 90-degree.
Yep. So when we talk about the high path virus itself, it actually is not a very hardy virus. And so it has an envelope that we can disrupt with soap and water. And so the amount of time outside of the body is limited. The actual time frame itself, I cannot answer that. I'm not up to date on the virus research itself, but I do know we can do very simple things to help eradicate that virus. At the same time, I do know that from the monitoring by wildlife services, that when we look in water sources, and this could be just a small puddle of water around poultry facilities, things like that, and this monitoring was done in Iowa and Minnesota, they could pick up virus in that water source. So depending on where the virus is located, and to your point, the temperature and other conditions will in fact have an impact on how hardy that virus is. But in general, we know that we can easily dispose of that virus just with soap and water.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question. What role, if any, do domestic cats that hunt wild birds play in the spread of HPAI?
So that question, I'll defer to BOA if they know. I have not seen any science speaking to that specifically, beyond the fact that we know cats can become infected.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anything either. We just announced also earlier, if no one saw it, we do have a webinar next week to talk about wild birds specifically, and we can find out from our colleagues at Department of Natural Resources if they've heard anything about that as well. I know just outdoor cats is an issue with songbirds and other wild birds anyway.
Okay. Next question. What testing modality is being used to evaluate food sources?
What was the last part of that, Jared? To test what?
I'm sorry. What testing modality is being used to evaluate food sources?
Denise, would you like to speak to that? I saw you unmute.
Yes, I'll field that one. The food supply is not specifically being tested for high path, other than dairy farms where there is milk surveillance happening just to find out what the status of the farm is. So right now, current policy is if we have an affected barn with the poultry products and eggs are not shipping into the food supply. So really, from that perspective, there's no reason to be monitoring the food supply for that.
Okay. Next question. Can we get testing of birds paid for?
So yes, depending on resources available through the Indiana State Poultry Association, the diagnostic lab here at Purdue works with them, and there are monies that can be used to offset that cost, or in some instances, make it free. That is something that occurs when you are looking to submit those birds, having that conversation with the diagnostic lab.
Hi, Dr. Karcher. I might add, and Denise and Jared. My name is Brandy, and I'm here with the Board of Animal Health as well. Testing can also be covered if you do suspect that your small flock does have highly pathogenic avian influenza by reporting on our small flock reporting form on our website. So if there is a high concern, we can definitely help you out in that aspect. And then also if you were to be in one of those infected zone circles or control area aspects, you would get a notification to your small flock if you're already registered, which Dr. Karcher highly recommended that everybody go ahead and register their premises with us, but that really does benefit you guys in the long run, because if you were to end up in one of those circles, we would contact you and then offer you free testing at that time since you were relatively close to a positive farm. So at those points, then testing can be covered as well for free. Thank you.
Thanks, Brandy.
Thank you for that. Going down the list here, what is proper disposal? I think that refers to of dead poultry.
Yes, and I think I saw Denise throw some information in there related to proper disposal within the chat. So I'll defer to what was added to the chat there, Jared.
Yes, basically, if it's small scale backyard flock, double bagging and putting in residential trash is acceptable. You can also bury there. If it's a large scale situation, then we have other methods that we look at that just to address it based on how much material there is.
And just a word of caution, if you double bag, I would suggest a black bag and not clear plastic.
All right. Another question. Good suggestions for quarantine after showing or purchasing no new birds that were added to the flock.
So you said suggestions, Jared?
Yeah, suggestions for quarantine
Okay.
after showing or purchasing new birds.
Yep. So typically, if I was to help you come up with a way to approach quarantine, if you have the capacity to have a separate poultry area entirely away from your flock, that would be the ideal situation. What that could look like is if you have a small area, say within your garage, that you could set up for 4 to 6 birds, depending on how many you have, and your chicken flock then is some other place on your premise, that would be ideal. And you keep them there in your garage and care for them in that area and then move them. If your only option is to put your chickens back into your chicken coop, I would try to do it where you can completely segregate those chickens to one side, have a 3 to 4 foot area between that side of the chicken coop to the next space of where your actual birds are. The reason being is that if the birds can access the fecal droppings, they still can pick up something. So that 3 to 4 foot area between the pens would allow the fact that if you have your quarantine birds and they have fecal material that comes outside of the pen, it is within an area then that the other birds cannot easily gain access to pick through that fecal material. So those would be kind of the two extremes for how you could approach the quarantine.
Thank you. We're getting close to end of time here, so we'll just do a few more questions.
Maybe we should address the issue about exhibition coming up. I know there's been quite a few questions in the chat about that. And 4-H fairs, are we going to suspend things? Because we took that step back in 2016, if you may remember. Currently, the Board of Animal Health does not plan to restrict any exhibitions per se on a broad scale. We're monitoring the situation. And all we ask at this point is that exhibitions not be held in counties where there is a current active control area. And that can be found on our website where those counties are as well. And we update those almost daily. And Darren, do you want to mention anything about NPIP testing as far as for exhibition birds?
Sure. So in order for your exhibition birds, hopefully those that have been doing it in the past, you are aware that there is the requirement to have your birds palorum tested for the National Poultry Improvement Plan, and you can identify testers to do that. If you are looking to also establish your exhibition birds as an opportunity to sell eggs or chicks to others, you can also go through a process through the National Poultry Improvement Plan where you can certify your flock, giving you that opportunity then to have NPIP clean chicks or eggs at which you can sell. All of that information and the process in which you would need to go through it can be found at the Indiana State Poultry Association website. And I'll ask Denise or Jared if somebody can just throw that into the chat. But you can go to their website. You can find the information. I know that they will be having their classes coming up here in the next few months. And so that would be your opportunity if you want to go into the National Poultry Improvement Program.
Okay, I think one question's getting asked is, what can you cover symptoms for high-path avian influenza? What you might see when you walk out?
Yep. And so when we talk about symptoms for high path, because it is high path, the symptom is going to be death. But the reality is, the way you may be aware that your birds are having an issue, if you think back to the earlier part of the presentation where I had the pictures of the turkeys, you may notice your birds look sick. And what do I mean by that? They're going to sit there, they're going to pull their head into their body, they're going to ruffle their feathers out, and they just look like they do not feel good. That will probably be one of your biggest indicators that you have a disease concern that you need to be talking to someone very quickly. With high path, we know it can be you check your birds in the morning before you go to work, go to school, you come home. That is exactly what those birds look like. That is the point at which you need to be reaching out for some assistance.
Here's a softball question for you, Darren. Is ordering baby chicks from a hatchery safe?
Yeah, I can't not say enough about mail order hatcheries. It is. And so the thing to keep in mind is that when you are ordering chicks from mail order hatcheries, they are going to be NPIP approved providers of chicks, and you can even go and check online through USDA to verify that. But they are also doing some of the things we've talked about today to ensure that you have a successful start with your chicks. So they are monitoring for diseases. They are making sure they're following proper biosecurity. All of those pieces are going to be in place. You should not feel concerned about ordering chicks through the mail as opposed to getting them from TSC or some other farm store. So there is no concern there that you should have at this point in time.
All right. We have so many more questions. There's lots of questions coming. I do want to, I don't know if you want to stay on and go any longer or not, but I do want to mention to folks that we do have another webinar coming up next week that our partners, the avian biologists for the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, will be on. And this is next Thursday at noon. I put the registration in the chat a couple of times. And he will be talking about wild bird issues. And also our partners at Indiana Department of Health will be talking about human health concerns if anybody has questions there. So I want to make sure folks are aware of that as well. So
awesome. Unfortunately, I do have to run to another meeting that started a few minutes ago. However, Denise, if you guys would like, I'm more than willing to work with you to go through and answer questions that you guys can then post if you do that. But if so, just reach out. I'm more than willing to help you.
Okay, we could do that. The other thing to note is this recording will be available on the Board of Animal Health's YouTube channel probably in about a week. And that may be a good place we can post some of the questions there in the comments along with it. So we really appreciate your help, Darren.
Yep, no problem. And thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today.